ever get that feeling? Like there's this, I don't know, this deeper level to things. Like we're not seeing the whole picture.
Oh, absolutely. That sense that there are these forces, these unseen hands shaping the world around us.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And, being someone who loves to dig a little deeper, uncover those hidden connections, well, today's deep dive is right up our alley.
We're going to be exploring some pretty fascinating and, let's be honest, controversial ideas.
Right. We're talking about Lady Queen Bro's Occult Theocracy.
A book published, posthumously, actually, back in 1933.
And it really dives headfirst into this whole concept of well, she calls it a secret world.
This hidden network working behind the scenes, pulling the strings.
Yeah, yeah, infiltrating and controlling, and ultimately aiming to, well, she argues, undermine society as we know it.
It's a pretty bold claim.
Bold is an understatement, I think. So, before we get too far, it's important to remember this book, it wasn't written as some polished academic treatise.
No, no, not at all. It's more like a compilation of her research, her investigations. It's actually dedicated to her uncle, Lloyd E. Warren, who, you could say, guided her in this work.
Right. And right from the start, she's very clear about her intention.
She wants people to understand, to see the potential, the root causes of their downfall. Societal, moral, you name it.
And she truly believes that there are these specific strategies at play, these methods this secret world uses to achieve its aims. And that's what the book tries to lay bare.
To bring into the light.
Exactly. Now, the title itself is a mouthful, Occult Theocracy. Let's break that down a bit. How does the book define these terms?
Well, it starts by talking about this kind of evolution of spiritual thought. You have these profound insights, these metaphysical ideas, often coming from individuals.
Okay, like a personal revelation or a new way of seeing the world?
Right, right. And over time, these ideas get formalized. They become structured into, organized religions. You get doctrines, rituals, all that.
So from personal to organized faith. Makes sense.
And this is crucial in the book's view, this is where things take a turn. These religious systems, they can morph into theocracy.
Theocracy. Rule by the priesthood. Right.
Exactly. So you have this progression from insight to faith to religious figures wielding actual political power. That's the theocracy part of the equation.
Okay, so that's one half of the title. Now, where does the occult fit in?
Well, here, the book makes this distinction between what it calls esoteric and exoteric teachings.
Esoteric versus exoteric. That sounds familiar.
Right. So esoteric knowledge, that's the secret stuff, the deeper understanding held by a select few, the initiated.
Okay, like the inner circle.
Exactly. While exoteric teachings, those are the public-facing version, the more accessible doctrines. The example the book gives is the Egyptian high priesthood of Memphis. They supposedly held these very esoteric theories.
Ah, the mysteries of ancient Egypt. Always a good hook.
Right. And then you have Moses, who, according to the book, was part of that system, but then presented a more simplified, a more exoteric version to the Israelites.
In the form of, well, Jehovah.
Precisely. So you have this core of secret knowledge and then a more, shall we say, digestible version for the masses.
Like a public-facing explanation alongside the hidden truth. Fascinating. And occultism itself. How does the book define that term?
It's described as the development of human psychic abilities, things like, telepathy, clairvoyance, that sort of thing.
The hidden potential of the mind.
Right. And the book argues that if these abilities are misused, well, that's where you get what we understand as magic. It also connects this to Hermeticism, this ancient tradition of spiritual and philosophical thought.
Hermeticism. I've heard that term, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Well, think of it as the esoteric heart of all religions, focusing on those hidden dimensions, those secret teachings.
Okay, so we have this framework, theocracy, arising from religion, rooted in deeper spiritual ideas, and then occultism as this potentially dangerous aspect of human potential linked to those esoteric cores.
That's a pretty good summary, yeah.
Now, the book goes on to discuss specific groups and belief systems, and Luciferianism and the Kabbalah feature quite prominently.
Oh, yes, they're central to the book's argument, really. So Luciferianism, the book claims that there are these secret groups out there with what it calls a perverted moral compass.
Perverted? That's strong language.
It is, isn't it? And these groups, they believe in, and get this, secretly worship Lucifer.
Lucifer, as in the devil.
Yeah, but not just as the devil. They see him as an equal to God. The book even points to Bataille's Le Diable no siècle to back this up.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea, elevating Lucifer to the level of the divine. And how does the Kabbalah connect to all this?
Well, the book presents modern occultism as this blend of practical Kabbalah and Indian yogism.
Okay, so two seemingly very different traditions.
Right. But they're woven together in this occult tapestry. And the Kabbalah itself is defined as occult science. It's the secret theology of the initiated.
Almost like a shadow religion, you could say.
Yeah, and the book goes as far as to call it a satanic counter-theology.
Whoa, so not just a system of mystical interpretation, but something actively opposed to, well, to Christianity, really.
Exactly. Now, the book also gets into the nitty-gritty of magic, like different types of magical practices.
I remember that. It divides magic into two main categories, right?
It does. Divining magic and operative magic.
Okay, so divining magic, that's about gaining knowledge, understanding hidden things.
Right. Things like astrology, palmistry, even dream interpretation.
And operative magic.
That's about, well, causing change in the world, making things happen. The book doesn't go into too much detail about the specific practices at this point.
Right, right. But one type of magic that does get mentioned is necromancy. That's about communicating with the dead, isn't it?
Yeah, trying to contact spirits. And the book sees it as a kind of hybrid, partly divining, partly operative. It involves attempting to, well, evoke the spirits of the deceased.
Seances, mediums, all that.
Exactly. And it connects this directly to modern spiritism, even things like table rapping.
Wow. So not just ancient rituals, but something that, according to the book, is happening right under our noses.
And it makes a pretty bold claim saying that all Kabbalists practice necromancy.
All of them. That's a pretty sweeping statement.
It is. No, another key element in the book's argument is Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. This is that ancient religious movement that emphasized, what was it, inner knowledge? Right.
Yeah, gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine. And that book paints it as being, well, deeply problematic, to say the least. It claims that the heads of what it calls satanic sects, they actually hold high Masonic degrees.
High Masonic degrees. So there's this connection between Gnosticism and Freemasonry.
That's what the book argues. And it claims these high-ranking Masons can admit members of other, well, similar groups into their lodges. Groups like the Odd Fellows, the Chinese Sanhohu, even Luciferian fakirs.
Wow. Like this whole network of secret societies operating behind the scenes.
That's the picture it paints. And Gnosticism itself is presented as something both ancient and enduring. It says it bears the seal of Lucifer, going all the way back to the time of the Apostle Peter.
To the earliest days of Christianity.
Right. And it's continued to this day, the book argues, just changing its appearance over time, putting on different masks. It even cites Bataille again here.
So this ancient, well, heresy, in the book's view, is still active today, working against the true faith.
That's the argument. And the book makes this very direct connection between Gnosticism and, as we were saying, Freemasonry. It claims that the 7 founders of Freemasonry, they were all Gnostics.
All of them.
Magi of the English Rose Croix, it says. It even names them. Théophile Desaguliers and others. And it explains that early Gnosticism opposed Christian doctrine by focusing on human knowledge. Putting human reason above divine revelation.
And it mentions some specific early Gnostic groups.
The Basilidians, the Ophites, the Valentinians, they held beliefs like metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, which, it argues, is similar to later ideas in Theosophy and Spiritism.
So reincarnation, basically.
Yeah, and Basilat of Alexandria is mentioned specifically. So the book is arguing that Freemasonry, this seemingly benign fraternal organization, actually has its roots in this ancient heresy, a very different take on its origins.
It's a pretty radical reinterpretation, to say the least. And this idea of these secret societies with their shared beliefs and aims stretching back centuries is central to the book's argument.
Absolutely. And one of the things the book explores is how these groups allegedly communicate and exert their influence.
It mentions some pretty intriguing methods.
It does. There's this mention of Madame Bouche, also known as Sister Salome, and Madame de Cridner. They were supposedly mediums for this spiritist sect called the Rescuers of Louis XVI.
The Rescuers of Louis VI. So a group trying to, restore the French monarchy?
Well, that's not entirely clear, but what's interesting is that these women, they supposedly had influence in the Russian court.
Through their spiritist connections.
The book seems to suggest that, yes, like they were using their supposed psychic abilities to gain political leverage.
Almost like a spiritual back channel of influence.
Right. And the book also mentions telepathy, which, was a hot topic back then.
Yeah, people were fascinated by the possibility of mind-to-mind communication.
Exactly. And the book suggests that telepathy could be exploited by these organizations. It references William Gay Hudson's writings on the subject.
So not just physical meetings and secret messages, but potentially a more, well, a psychic level of manipulation.
The book seems to hint at that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's hypnosis, another big area of interest at the time.
Hypnosis. Yeah, the power of suggestion.
Right. And the book notes this belief, attributed to Hudson, that you can't hypnotize someone into betraying their society's secrets.
Okay, so hypnosis has its limits.
Well, that's what Hudson believed. He thought it was due to autosuggestion, the person's own subconscious mind protecting those secrets. But the book itself argues that there's more to it than that.
Deeper reasons for this unbreakable loyalty.
Maybe even occult conditioning, it suggests. The book also mentions these hidden masters.
Hidden masters. Who are they?
Well, that's not entirely clear, but the idea is that there's this hierarchy within these occult groups, with guidance coming from these unseen figures.
Like puppet masters pulling the strings from the shadows.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, the book discusses the Freemason initiation ritual.
Ah, yes, those secret ceremonies, always shrouded in mystery.
Right, and the book describes it as having a very specific character, suggesting, quote, real knowledge of the occult physiology of the process.
Occult physiology, what does that even mean?
It's not entirely clear, but it claims that certain forces are transmitted through the candidate's body during the initiation.
So the rituals themselves have a tangible effect on the person.
That's what the book suggests. Like there's this occult power being transferred. So you see, the book lays out this whole multifaceted approach to communication and influence, from spiritism to telepathy to hypnosis to the rituals themselves.
It's a pretty complex picture, and we've only just scratched the surface. Now, the book also delves into Eastern religions, drawing some interesting parallels.
It does. It talks about this ancient division in Indian religious worship between the followers of Vishnu, the preserver, and those who worshipped Shiva, the destroyer.
Vishnu and Shiva, two of the major Hindu deities.
Right. And Shiva, the book connects him to the Egyptian god Typhon, both representing destruction, chaos.
Okay, so this ancient split within Hinduism.
And the book suggests that this division might have contributed to the development of the caste system and to theocratic tyranny by the Brahmins.
The Brahmins being the priestly class. So this religious division leading to social hierarchy and oppression.
That's the idea. It also references Stilson and Hewen's work on Freemasonry in this context.
Drawing a connection between, ancient Indian religion and Freemasonry.
It's a bit of a leap, yeah. But that's how the book presents it. Now, the book also gets into some of the more extreme aspects of Brahmanism.
Extreme in what sense?
Well, it mentions Joliot's description of what it calls perverted Brahmanism.
Perverted. Again, that's pretty strong language.
I know, and it's talking about these bodily mortifications that certain sects practiced. Asceticism taken to a pretty extreme level.
Okay, so self-denial, pushing the body to its limits as a form of spiritual practice.
Right. And the book sees it as evidence of this darker side of Hinduism.
And the caste system. How did the Brahmins allegedly justify that?
Well, the book claims they drew a parallel to their divinity, Zeus or Brahma. They saw it as a reflection of the cosmic order, divinely ordained.
Using religion to reinforce social stratification.
Exactly. Now, the book then moves on to the Hindu votaries of the Pitris.
The Pitris. Who are they?
The spirits of the ancestors, ancestral spirits. And the book suggests a connection between them and, get this, ancient Jewish Kabbalists.
A link between Hinduism and Kabbalah.
It's based on this text called the Agrachata Parichai. The book's always trying to find these connections, these underlying threads between different traditions.
It's creating this whole web of interconnectedness.
Exactly. And it also doesn't shy away from some of the darker aspects of Hindu deities.
I remember it talks about Kali, the goddess of destruction.
It describes the rites associated with Kali as cruel and bloodthirsty. It draws parallels to Moloch, Typhon, Saturn, all these figures associated with death and destruction. Sellen's work is referenced here.
So a very negative portrayal of a major Hindu goddess.
It is. It also talks about this sect, the Kal sect, and their, shall we say, unusual worship practices.
Unusual how?
Well, they allegedly disregarded traditional family ties involving, communal women in their rituals.
Communal women. What does that mean?
It's not entirely clear, but it mentions women depositing their julis, their bodices, in a box overseen by the guru at the end of their ceremonies. Again, it's citing Selen as the source.
Wow, that's pretty strange.
It is. And then there's the Linga Puga,
Linga Puga.
phallus worship. The book presents it as this popular Hindu dogma combined with the worship of power, which it equates with Gnosticism.
Okay, so another link back to Gnosticism.
Right. And finally, it gets to this sect of Kali's worshippers, the thugs.
The thugs. That's a name that sends shivers down your spine.
It does, doesn't it? They were known as the Sons of Death. The book describes their initiation, their oath of silence, and their alleged goal of, well, destroying the human race. It even calls them the Rex Sacrificulus, the sacrificial king.
Whoa! That's a pretty heavy accusation, dedicated to wiping out humanity.
The book certainly doesn't hold back, and it highlights the political significance of such a group, especially in a theocracy, saying that rulers could use them, these fanatics, as assassins, basically.
So, religious fervor being manipulated for political ends. It's a chilling thought. Now, the book also looks at other religious and philosophical movements beyond the ones we've discussed so far. It mentions Zoroaster and Mazdism.
Right, that ancient Persian religion. It gives an overview of its teachings. The immortality of the soul, heaven and hell, resurrection, judgment day, all that. And it contrasts this with Islamic fatalism.
Okay, so free will versus predestination.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
And it also talks about Confucianism and Taoism in China.
Yeah, saying that in pre-Christian China, social life was based on family cults, and that belief in a single god was limited to a few.
So ancestor worship and a more philosophical approach to spirituality.
That's the picture it paints.
And then it turns to Judaism, focusing on the Pharisees.
The Pharisees, that strict Jewish sect. The book describes them as being heavily influenced by, by pantheistic Chaldeism.
Pantheistic Chaldeism.
Yeah.
That's Babylonian mysticism, right?
Right. And it says that even though they maintained the strong Jewish identity focused on their own superiority, they were secretly trying to shift people towards their own hidden doctrine.
So even within Judaism, the book sees this undercurrent of secret agendas.
It does. It mentions the election of Hillel as president of the Sanhedrin and the conflict with Shammai, highlighting internal tensions within Judaism.
Right. And it also quotes some pretty harsh statements about non-Jews, allegedly from the Talmud.
Yeah, it says things like, it's okay to cheat non-Jews, that a Jew isn't responsible for killing a non-Jew. Quotes like that. It cites Panashtis, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Shulchan Aruch as sources.
Those are some pretty disturbing statements.
They are. And the book's explanation for this is that the authors of the Talmud kept its true content secret from non-Jews.
To what? To maintain their advantage.
To create strife, it says. A pretty cynical view of religious texts being used to sow division.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the book also touches on the Old Testament, but in a Masonic context.
It suggests that Masons might see the Old Testament as mistaken allegorical history. It references Carlyle's Manual of Freemasonry here.
So not taking the Bible literally.
Right. And it also talks about the ancient mysteries of Greece, like the Eleusinian mysteries.
Those secret rituals dedicated to Demeter.
Right. And the book claims they had these, quote, infamous origins involving obscene rites. It cites Faber's The Origin of Pagan Idolatry here.
So even these ancient revered traditions are seen in a negative light.
That's the pattern we're seeing. It also mentions Pyrrho, that Greek philosopher who advocated universal doubt.
Skepticism taken to the extreme.
Right. And it says the atomists, who couldn't prove their own theories, ended up joining the Pyrrhonists, embracing this philosophy of doubt.
Interesting. So even ancient Greek philosophy is brought into the mix.
It is. And then the book moves on to Druidism in Britain.
The ancient Celtic priests.
Yeah. The book describes Druidism as encompassing all religious and philosophical knowledge in Britain at the time. It mentions the astronomical references in their rites, their chief deities, Hu and Ceridwen. It even draws parallels to Osiris and Isis, Bacchus and Ceres. It's citing Borlas's The Antiquities of Cornwall here.
So finding those common threads again across different cultures and time periods.
Exactly. And it also makes this direct comparison between the teachings of Christ and what it calls occult doctrine.
This seems like a key point in the book's argument.
It is. It contrasts Christ's teachings, which it sees as emphasizing light from without, reliance on God and miracles, with this alleged secret doctrine of high adepts.
Okay, so two opposing spiritual paths.
Right. The occult doctrine, it says, focuses on the divinity within man, developed through will and psychic power, and it emphasizes fear.
Fear versus faith and love.
That's the contrast it's drawing.
And then it gets into witchcraft and Gnosticism, linking them together as, quote, heretics.
Yeah, it talks about witch meetings, those obscene phallic rites, the Black Mass, all that. And it describes Gnosticism as being based on Spiritism, with mediums claiming to get instructions from gods or spirits. It mentions Simon Magus, this early Gnostic figure, and cites Lavington's The Moravians compared and detected here.
So connecting witchcraft to Gnosticism, both seen as well as enemies of the true faith.
Right, and it doesn't hold back on the details about early Gnostic groups.
I remember it talks about their views on sexuality.
It claims they practiced, quote, promiscuous use of women and twisted scripture to justify it, citing Lavington and Clemens Alexandrinus.
So a pretty scandalous portrayal.
It is. Now, the book then turns to Lamaism in Tibet.
Tibetan Buddhism.
It describes Lamaism as being founded around 407 AD by Chomshtym, and it says it was both a religion and a theistic government in Tibet. It mentions its establishment under Genghis Khan and its later influence.
So religion and politics intertwined.
Right, and it explains this concept of a tulku.
A tulku, what's that?
It's either the reincarnation of a saint or a sage, or the incarnation of a superhuman being. It quotes the Dalai Lama via Madame David Neal here.
So like a living embodiment of spiritual wisdom.
That's the idea. And it also talks about the Tibetan occultist view on gods, saying that they believe gods gain real existence through concentrated thought.
Thought creates reality.
Yeah, that's the concept. And it compares this to Western ideas about thought forms, citing David Neal again.
So the power of the mind to shape reality.
That's the idea. Now, the book then moves on to the assassins.
The assassins, that infamous group of assassins.
Right. It describes the founding of the Fatimite Caliphate in Cairo with its army of assassins, spreading their influence through blind obedience.
A terrifying force.
It gives examples of their alleged involvement in political assassinations. Richard I, Frederick II, the Duke of Austria, all victims of the assassins.
A secret society wielding deadly power.
Exactly. And then it mentions the Knights Templar, especially their downfall.
The Templars. Those warrior monks.
The book says their suppression in 1256 was attributed by many to the assassins, suggesting infiltration or corruption.
So these secret societies clashing with each other.
Right. And then we come to the Rosicrucians.
The Rosicrucians, always shrouded in mystery.
It mentions these treatises defending the Rosicrucian order by Robert Flood and Julius Sperber, and it talks about Michael Mayer, a physician to Rudolph II, and his Rosicrucian works.
Okay, so influential figures promoting Rosicrucian ideas.
Right. And then it mentions these 7 unknown superiors of the Rosicrucians, who supposedly decreed in 1623 that they would destroy the church by 1717.
Destroy the church. That's a pretty bold goal.
It is, and it links this to Valentin Andrea's story of the Rose-Croix.
The mythical founder of the order.
Right, and it connects Rosicrucianism to Socinianism through Julius Sperber and Kaminsky, and it mentions Rose-Croix brothers mingling with Freemasons.
So more connections, more intertwining threads.
Exactly. The book also mentions the Albigenses.
Those medieval heretics.
It describes them as encompassing various heretical groups and as representing a revolt against the 12th century church.
Okay, so another challenge to religious authority.
Right. And then it talks about the Moravians.
A Protestant sect, right?
Yeah. And the book claims they wanted to establish a theocracy independent of earthly governments. It cites a letter from Count Zinzendorf here.
So spiritual authority superseding secular power.
That's the idea. It also mentions the Invisible College.
The Invisible College. Wasn't that a precursor to the Royal Society?
Right. It talks about Samuel Hartlib's advocacy for a secret society of all classes working for the benefit of humanity, and it connects this to Christian Rosenkreuz.
Okay, so even groups with seemingly positive aims are seen through this lens of secrecy.
That's right. Now back to Freemasonry. The book delves into the higher degrees.
Beyond the basic levels.
It explains that these higher grades, like the Scottish Rite and the Grand Orient, select members from the original English system. And while English Masonry claims to be purely charitable, these higher degrees are, well, more esoteric.
More secretive, more mysterious.
Exactly. It gives an esoteric interpretation of the third-degree ritual from Paul Rosen's Masonnerie Pratique, talking about the symbolism, the hidden meanings, and it notes that some of these sources are hard to come by. It also includes a news clipping from 1930 about a Masonic lodge consecration with political figures involved.
So evidence of their influence in society.
Right. It then lists some specific groups it claims are linked to Freemasonry.
Subversive groups.
The strict observance, which shifted from occultism to political intrigue, and the Martinists, who combined politics and magic. It quotes Adolphe Camus' ambition for Freemasonry and the goals outlined in Jean Zoulet's Paris, Capitale de Religion.
So Freemasonry as a tool for achieving, well, some hidden agenda.
That's the claim.
You
And then
know
it
that?
talks about what it calls the preparation.
The preparation for what?
For this grand subversion, this takeover, it draws on Stilson and Hewen, Margiotta, others. It identifies Adriana Lemmy as a key figure, though it gets Frederick II wrong. It talks about Stephen Moran's charter for the Council of the Emperors of the East and West and his activities in America.
Okay, so establishing these networks of influence.
Right. And it discusses the development of the Scottish Rite with figures like Moses Hayes and Henry Franken. It notes the secrecy surrounding the 33rd degree, referencing Blanchard's Scottish Rite Masonry, and it quotes Carlyle's warning about secret societies in England. It even talks about modern reenactments of the, quote, shameful orgies of Medmenham.
Orgies. That's quite a claim.
Linking these historical groups to contemporary decadence is pretty sensational stuff. It also mentions General Pepe and the idea of a one big union.
One big union. What's that referring to?
It talks about Masonry's failed attempt to overthrow Austrian rule in Italy in 1821 and General Pepe's involvement.
Okay, so political ambitions and conspiracies.
Right. Now we come to two big figures, Albert Pike and Giuseppe Mazzini.
Pike and Mazzini. Two names that pop up a lot in discussions of secret societies.
They do. It details Pike's Masonic career, his connections to various lodges, the Odd Fellows, the Royal Arch, the Scottish Rite, his election as Grand Master in Charleston, and his alleged reestablishment of Luciferian doctrine within High Masonry.
Bringing Lucifer back into the fold.
That's what it claims. It quotes Pike's statement about Lucifer and Adonai from Margiotta and Rosen.
So this idea of Lucifer as a positive force.
Right. It also mentions Pike's involvement in Kabbalah and Spiritism, even recounting an anecdote about a seance in St. Louis where he supposedly received revelations from Lemmy and Astroff. It cites Bataille again here. It also describes the Palladian organization with its 7 directories and their symbolic locations.
Okay, so a more occult side to Pike's activities.
Right. And it tells this story about American Masons and a prisoner in Fort Niagara where Canadian Masons refused to cooperate, leading to the opening of a Knight Templar encampment. It explains the structure of Freemasonry with its male and female lodges and the restrictions on visiting.
Separate spheres for men and women.
Right. And it mentions Pike's statement about the destruction of records in Charleston during the Civil War. It also talks about general inspectresses in high-grade women's masonry communicating with Charleston. It describes the strategy of slowly leading men to higher degrees and the use of the Lodge of Adoption as a control mechanism.
So a very calculated and strategic approach.
Right. And it says that a lodge without a female counterpart is considered incomplete. Now, Mazzini, the Italian revolutionary, is also discussed extensively.
Mazzini, the fighter for Italian unification.
It lists all his young movements. Young Italy, young Switzerland, young Ireland, young Germany, their founding dates, key figures, all that. It provides the oath of young Italy, emphasizing dedication to a free Italy and obedience to the association.
Loyalty and commitment to the cause.
Right. And it talks about Mazzini's involvement in revolutionary activities and the attempted assassination of Baldissaroni. It includes a letter from Francesco Crispi to Mazzini in 1853, revealing tensions and Crispi's view of Lemmy as an enemy. It mentions Mazzini's continued efforts, even after setbacks, and it talks about Lemmy's alleged exploitation of the Crimean War, making money off ambulance contracts and fleeing to Malta.
So profiteering from war.
Right. It connects Isaac Artem, Cavour's secretary, and Lopere, a rabbi and Mazzini's friend, to the cause of Italian independence and Freemasonry. It mentions the support of English, French, and Prussian Freemasons. And it discusses Felice Orsini's plot to assassinate Napoleon III and its impact on Italian unification. It even quotes Monsieur Keller's remark about it. It also brings up Isaac Disraeli's refusal to lead a Jewish sect in London and whether the offer was made to his son, Benjamin Disraeli. And it quotes AAB's comment about Marianne Disraeli ruling the underworld of secret societies.
Wow. So even Disraeli is brought into this web of intrigue.
He is. And it describes a secret meeting in Italy in 1860, attended by high-ranking Masons, to figure out what to do after Napoleon's potential defeat. It mentions the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, becoming a Knight Kadosh and a Filier Superior of the Grand Orient.
Okay, so royalty involved in these secret societies.
Right. And it explains.
Yeah.